The first rays of dawn were just painting the eastern sky in hues of bruised purple and fiery orange when I saw them. 50 Comanche warriors, their war paint stark and gleaming in the nascent light, surrounded my ranch. Every single one of them wanted the girl I'd hidden in my barn just 3 hours earlier. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic drum against the silence of the prairie. This wasn't just a raid. This was a reckoning. My name is Jedediah Stone, though most folks just call me Jed. This land, this ranch, it was all I had left after the raiders took Alara, my wife, 3 years ago. That memory, raw and burning, was a constant companion, a shadow that clung to my every step. And now here I stood facing the very people who had shattered my world, all because of a choice I'd made, a choice that defied every instinct for self-preservation I possessed. Just 3 hours before, I'd been checking my cattle near Willow Creek. The morning air was crisp, carrying the scent of damp earth and distant sage. Then the gunshots. Sharp, desperate cracks that echoed across the vast, empty prairie. In Texas territory in 1876, gunshots weren't unusual. Soldiers, bandits, tribal raids. They happened weekly, a grim rhythm to our lives out here. But something about these shots felt different. Desperate. Final. A cold knot tightened in my gut. Every fiber of my being screamed at me to ride the opposite direction, to mind my own business. Smart ranchers did. But I'd never been accused of being smart. My spurs dug into my horse's flanks, urging him toward the sound, toward the unknown. What I found changed everything. She lay bleeding behind a fallen cottonwood, a young Comanche girl no older than 16. Her buckskin dress was soaked crimson, the fabric clinging to her slender frame. An army bullet had found its mark deep in her shoulder, and her breathing came in short, painful gasps. Her eyes, though, were what truly struck me. Fierce. Dark. They showed no fear, only defiance, a burning ember in the face of death. My hand instinctively moved to my rifle, the familiar weight, a cold comfort. 3 years ago, Comanche raiders had burned my neighbor's farm, had taken Alara from me. The smart thing, the logical thing, would be to ride away. Let nature take its course. The territory would be safer with one less Comanche. But those eyes, they reminded me of Alara's. Not in appearance, no. Alara's eyes had been the color of the summer sky, gentle and full of laughter. But in their refusal to surrender, in that stubborn spark of life against overwhelming odds, they were painfully similar. The girl tried to crawl away when she saw me leaving a fresh trail of blood on the dry earth. She spoke rapid Comanche words, a guttural torrent. I didn't understand, but her meaning was clear. Stay back. Don't touch me. I dismounted slowly, my hands visible, a gesture of peace in a land that knew little of it. The girl's breathing was getting weaker, each gasp shallower than the last. Without medical attention, she'd be dead within the hour. The thought gnawed at me. I thought about Alara, about the promise I'd made at her grave to never let hatred consume what was left of my soul, to honor her memory not with vengeance but with something better. With a deep breath, I scooped the girl into my arms. She fought weakly at first, a desperate flailing resistance, then went limp from blood loss and exhaustion. Her weight was nothing, barely more than a bundle of kindling. She was severely malnourished, probably fleeing with her band for weeks, living on scraps, running from shadows. The ride back to my ranch felt eternal. Every rustle in the tall grass could hide a war party. Every bird call might signal pursuit. The sun climbed higher, beating down on us, and the air grew thick with unspoken tension. But I pressed on the girl's labored breathing, the only sound between us, a fragile rhythm against the vast silence of the prairie. At my cabin, I carried her to the barn, laying her gently on a bed of fresh hay. The bullet needed to come out immediately. I knew what I had to do, but my hands trembled as I heated my knife in the small fire I'd built. Crude surgery. It would either save her life or end her suffering. There was no middle ground. As the blade glowed dull red, the girl's eyes fluttered open. She stared at me, her dark gaze filled with a mixture of confusion and raw terror. Why was this white man helping her? What did he want in return? The questions hung unspoken in the air between us. I began working on the wound, my movements as precise as I could make them despite the shaking in my hands. The girl bit down on a leather strap I'd offered, muffling her screams, though guttural whimpers still escaped her lips. For 20 agonizing minutes, I dug out bullet fragments, each one a tiny shard of pain. She bled. She trembled. I felt her small body convulse beneath my touch. Finally, mercifully, the bleeding stopped. The girl passed out from pain and exhaustion, her head lolling to the side. That's when I heard them. The war drums, distant at first, a faint thrum against the vast silence, then growing closer with each beat, a relentless pulse that vibrated through the very ground beneath my feet. My blood ran cold. They had found her. They had found me. The drums stopped at sunrise, and that's when I knew. They were here. I peered through the barn slats, my breath catching in my throat. 50 mounted warriors. Painted for war, their faces grim, their bodies lean and powerful. They surrounded my property in a perfect silent circle, a living wall of vengeance. Their leader sat tall on a painted stallion, an older man with streaks of gray in his braided hair, and scars etched across his chest that spoke of countless battles. His eyes, even from this distance, burned with a cold, unwavering fury. Behind me, Kaylin stirred a soft moan escaping her lips. Fever was burning through her small frame, her skin flushed and hot to the touch. She whispered something in Comanche, her voice barely audible, a fragile thread of sound. I didn't need translation. She was calling for her father. The war chief raised his hand and the circle tightened. I could see the fury in their eyes, a palpable hatred that seemed to scorch the air. Their horses stamped and snorted, eager for violence. These weren't raiders looking for cattle or supplies. These were grieving warriors who'd tracked their missing daughter through 20 miles of dangerous territory, driven by a primal need for justice. My gaze swept over my meager defenses. 1 rifle, 2 pistols, maybe 30 rounds total. Against 50 experienced fighters, I might last 5 minutes if I was lucky. But running wasn't an option anymore. Kaylin couldn't be moved, not in her condition. And even if she could, we'd never outrun war horses across the open prairie. We were trapped. The chief's voice carried across the morning air, broken English but clear as thunder. "White man, you have what belongs to us." My mouth went dry. How could I explain this? That I'd saved their daughter's life. That I'd risked everything to help her. In their eyes, I was just another settler who'd taken something precious from them. I thought about responding, trying to negotiate. But what could I say? That I'd found her bleeding and brought her home. They'd see it as kidnapping. That I'd operated on her wound. They'd call it torture. Kaylin tried to sit up, wincing from the pain, a small cry escaping her lips. She looked at me with new understanding, a terrible realization dawning in her fevered eyes. I hadn't saved her. I'd made myself a target. Now both of us would die because of my misguided compassion. "Kaylin," the chief shouted, his voice laced with anguish. The girl's eyes filled with tears, a single tear tracing a path through the grime and sweat on her cheek. She tried to call back a desperate plea, but her voice was too weak to carry. I made a decision, one that would haunt me for the rest of my days, but one I knew deep in my gut was the only path forward. I stepped out of the barn, my hands raised high, leaving my weapons behind. 50 arrows tracked my movement, their points glinting ominously in the sunlight. 50 fingers tightened on bowstrings, ready to loose death upon me. "She's alive," I called out, my voice raspy but firm. "Your daughter is alive, but she's hurt bad." The chief's expression didn't change. If anything, the rage in his eyes intensified. A white man claiming to help his daughter was worse than a white man who'd harmed her. At least enemies were honest about their intentions. "You lie," Chief Bearclaw spat, his words dripping with contempt. "Show her to us." That's when I realized my terrible mistake. If I brought Kaylin out, they'd see the crude surgery, the blood-stained bandages, the way she could barely stand. To them, it would look like torture, not treatment. But if I refused to show her, they'd storm the barn anyway, and the violence would be uncontrollable. Behind me, Kaylin was struggling to her feet, determination overriding her pain. She had something to prove to her father, something to say that might save both our lives. The question was, would she defend the man who'd saved her, or would she condemn me to save herself? Kaylin stumbled from the barn, clutching her bandaged shoulder, her small body swaying precariously. She spoke 3 words in Comanche, her voice thin but clear, words that made her father's war paint seem to drain of color. "He saved me." Chief Bearclaw's stallion reared, startled by the sudden shift in the air, as he processed what his daughter had said. For a moment, the only sounds were the wind whispering through the prairie grass, and the creaking of leather as 50 warriors shifted in their saddles, uncertain now about their mission of vengeance. My heart pounded a frantic drumbeat in the sudden eerie silence. It wasn't over. I could see it in the chief's eyes, in the way his gaze flickered between Kaylin and me. His lieutenant, a younger warrior with fresh scalps hanging from his belt, rode closer, whispering urgently in Chief Bearclaw's ear. "Broken tooth." His gestures toward me were clear. This was still a trick. Still a trap. His eyes, cold and hard, promised only death. Kaylin took 3 shaky steps toward her father, her legs giving way beneath her. She collapsed onto the dusty ground, a soft cry escaping her lips. The fever was consuming her, and the effort of standing had drained what little strength she'd recovered. I instinctively moved to help her, but 20 arrows swung toward my chest, their points gleaming like malevolent eyes. "Don't," Chief Bearclaw warned in English, his voice a low growl. "Don't touch her again." 2 Comanche women dismounted swiftly and rushed to Kaylin's side. They knelt, their faces etched with concern, examining her bandages, feeling her burning forehead. They spoke in rapid, hushed tones, their words a blur of sound. I watched their faces change, the initial concern giving way to something else, a dawning realization. They saw the quality of the medical work, the clean stitching, the proper wound care. The fact that she was alive at all, against all odds. The older woman looked up at Chief Bearclaw and nodded once, a solemn gesture. The girl had been treated well. But Broken Tooth wasn't satisfied. He rode closer to me, his horse's hooves stopping just inches from my worn boots. Up close I could see the angry scars across his face, a roadmap of past battles, and hatred burning in his eyes like prairie fire. He was maybe 25, young, but hardened, a coiled spring of violence. "She is Chief's daughter, Broken Tooth," said in broken English, his voice laced with venom. "You take her, you die. All white men die." I realized this wasn't about Kaylin anymore. This young warrior wanted war. He wanted revenge for something that had happened long before today, something that had festered in his soul. Kaylin's rescue had given him the excuse he'd been looking for, a spark to ignite the flames of conflict. Chief Bearclaw was studying me with eyes that had seen 40 years of frontier violence, eyes that had witnessed unspeakable horrors and countless betrayals. "Why?" he asked simply, his voice devoid of emotion. "Why help enemy?" It was the question I had been asking myself since I'd first seen Kaylin bleeding behind that cottonwood. Why risk everything for a people who'd killed my wife? Why throw away my life for a stranger, for someone who should have been my enemy? Because she was dying. I said finally, the words raw and honest, torn from the depths of my soul. And I couldn't watch someone die when I could prevent it. Chief Bearclaw's expression shifted slightly, a flicker of something I couldn't quite decipher. Something in my words had reached him, a father recognizing another man's humanity, perhaps. But Broken Tooth spat in the dirt, a contemptuous gesture, and raised his rifle, aiming it squarely at my chest. "Lies, white man, lies, he keeps her for slave." For the accusation hung in the air like poison, a vile cloud settling over the ranch. I saw the doubt creeping back into Chief Bearclaw's eyes, saw the other warriors' faces hardening again, their hands moving instinctively to their weapons. This was it. This was where it ended. That's when Kaylin spoke again. Louder this time, her voice carrying across the silent ranch, thin but clear, cutting through the tension like a knife. Whatever she said made Broken Tooth's face go white with rage, his eyes widening in disbelief and terror. And then she said something else, something that made her father reach for his tomahawk, his hand moving with a speed that belied his age. Kaylin had told her father that Broken Tooth was the one who'd led her into the army ambush. She had witnessed his betrayal, and now the young warrior was reaching for his knife, his face contorted in a mask of desperate fury. The truth exploded across the ranch like lightning. Chief Bearclaw's tomahawk wasn't meant for me. It was for the traitor who'd gotten his daughter shot. Broken Tooth had been feeding information to the cavalry trading Comanche lives for army gold, and Kaylin had witnessed his treachery firsthand. "You speak lies, girl," Broken Tooth shouted, but his voice cracked with panic. A thin, reedy sound. Fever makes you crazy, but it was too late. 3 other warriors were already moving to surround Broken Tooth, their faces grim, their movements deliberate. Whatever Kaylin had said was specific enough, detailed enough that her father believed every word. Chief Bearclaw's face had transformed from anger to a cold, deadly rage that made the morning air feel like winter. But Broken Tooth wasn't finished. Desperate men make desperate choices, and he'd rather die fighting than face Comanche justice for treason. His rifle swung toward Kaylin, intent on silencing the only witness to his betrayal. I moved without thinking. 3 years of grief and guilt exploded into action, a primal roar escaping my lips as I tackled Broken Tooth from his horse. We hit the ground hard, rolling through dust and prairie grass, fighting for control of the weapon. The ranch erupted into chaos. Horses reared and screamed. Warriors shouted contradictory orders. Some wanted to shoot me for attacking their brother. Others wanted to help me stop a traitor. I felt Broken Tooth's knife slice across my ribs, a searing pain, but adrenaline numbed it almost instantly. This was the fight I'd been preparing for since Alara's death. Not against innocent people, not against those driven by desperation, but against the kind of evil that destroyed everything good in the world. We rolled again, a tangle of limbs and fury, and Broken Tooth ended up on top, pressing his blade toward my throat. The young warrior's face was twisted with rage and desperation, his eyes burning with a manic fire. "You should have minded your own business, white man," he snarled, his breath hot and foul against my face. I bucked upward, throwing Broken Tooth off balance. My hand found a rock, jagged and heavy, the size of my fist. One swing. It connected with the traitor's temple with a sickening thud, and the knife clattered away across the dirt. Broken Tooth lay still breathing, but unconscious, a thin trickle of blood seeping from his head wound onto the earth that had seen too much violence already. Silence settled over the ranch like a heavy blanket, broken only by the ragged sound of my own breathing. 50 warriors stared at me, the white man who had just risked his life to protect their chief's daughter from one of their own. Chief Bearclaw dismounted slowly and walked to where I knelt, breathing hard from the fight. For a long moment we looked at each other, two men who'd lost too much, seen too much, but who still recognized honor when they saw it. "You fight to protect my daughter," the chief said, simply, his voice now devoid of the earlier fury replaced by a quiet awe. "I'd do it again," I replied, surprising myself with the truth in those words. It wasn't just about Kaylin anymore. It was about a line I'd drawn, a stand I'd taken. Chief Bearclaw nodded once, a solemn gesture, then spoke rapidly in Comanche to his warriors. Half of them dismounted, their faces still grim but with a new understanding in their eyes. The other half began preparing to leave, but not in the way I had expected. Kaylin was being helped onto one of the horses despite her protests. She looked back at me, and in her eyes I saw something I hadn't expected, gratitude mixed with a genuine sadness. She knew what I had done. She knew the risk I had taken. But Chief Bearclaw wasn't done with his surprises. He pulled something from his belt and held it out to me. It was a medicine bag, intricately decorated with beadwork that must have taken months to complete a sacred object. "My daughter says you have lost wife to our people," the chief said quietly, his gaze steady. "This cannot bring her back, but it can protect you from dying before your time comes naturally." I stared at the offering, understanding the weight of what was being given. This wasn't just a gift. It was an adoption into protection, a promise that this band would never raid my land again. It was an acknowledgement of my humanity, a bridge built over a chasm of hatred and grief. But as my hand reached for the medicine bag, gunshots erupted from the ridge overlooking my ranch, sharp cracking sounds that ripped through the fragile peace. 20 cavalry soldiers appeared on the ridge, their rifles aimed at the Comanche below, and their commander was shouting orders to fire at will. The trap had been perfectly planned. Someone had told the army about the Comanche war party surrounding my ranch, and now 50 warriors were caught in the open with nowhere to run. Broken Tooth's betrayal ran deeper than anyone had realized. He hadn't just led Kaylin into an ambush, he'd set a trap for his own people, using me as bait. "Take cover," I shouted, my voice hoarse, but the Comanche were already moving with practiced efficiency. Within seconds, they transformed from a ceremonial gathering into a fighting force, using horses and buildings as shields against the rifle fire raining down from above. Chief Bearclaw grabbed Kaylin and pulled her behind my water trough just as bullets splintered the wood inches from her head. She was too weak to fight, too fevered to run, and now she was trapped in the middle of a massacre. I realized with sick clarity that this was exactly what Broken Tooth had planned: get caught helping a Comanche girl draw the war party to my ranch, then signal the cavalry for a surprise attack. The traitor would be hailed as a hero for leading the army to a decisive victory. But Broken Tooth hadn't counted on being exposed as a double agent. Now he was unconscious in the dirt while his carefully orchestrated betrayal played out around him. A Comanche warrior cried out as a bullet found his shoulder, his body slumping against his horse. Another's horse screamed a terrible high-pitched sound and collapsed, pinning its rider's leg beneath its weight. The cavalry had the high ground and superior firepower, but the Comanche had something more valuable, nothing left to lose. Thornfield Captain Sterling's voice carried over the gunfire, sharp and commanding. "Step away from the hostiles. We're here to rescue you." I looked at the Comanche warriors around me, men who'd been ready to kill me an hour ago, but who were now fighting to protect my property from destruction. Chief Bearclaw caught my eye and nodded toward the house, a silent command. "Go," the chief said, simply, his voice grim. "This is not your war." But I was already moving toward my cabin, not to surrender, but to retrieve my rifle and ammunition. The army thought they were rescuing me. They were about to learn that some rescues weren't wanted. I burst through my front door and grabbed my Winchester along with every box of cartridges I owned. Through my window, I could see the Comanche taking defensive positions around my barn and outbuildings, turning my ranch into a fortress. When I emerged with my rifle, several warriors stared in disbelief. Chief Bearclaw's eyes widened as he understood what the white man intended to do. "You choose to fight with us?" the chief asked, incredulous, his voice a low rumble. I choose to fight for what's right, I replied, my voice firm, taking aim at the ridge. The first cavalry charge came like thunder down the hillside, a wave of blue uniforms and flashing steel. And Jedediah Stone, the grieving rancher, took his shot. My first shot dropped Captain Sterling's sergeant, leading the charge, a clean hit that sent him tumbling from his horse. Suddenly, 20 soldiers were firing at the man they'd come to rescue. The irony wasn't lost on me as bullets shattered my cabin windows and splintered my porch railings. By choosing to stand with the Comanche, I'd made myself a target of my own people. But watching Chief Bearclaw fight to protect Kalen with the same desperate ferocity I'd once felt trying to save Alara, I knew I'd made the right choice. This wasn't about vengeance anymore. It was about protecting the innocent, about standing for something beyond the bitter divisions of this land. The Comanche were outnumbered and outgunned, but they fought with the precision of men who'd been warriors since childhood. They used every piece of cover, made every shot count, and turned my ranch into a killing field for anyone foolish enough to charge across open ground. Captain Sterling, a young officer with more ambition than experience, kept ordering frontal assaults that cost him men without gaining ground. After the third failed charge, his remaining soldiers were getting reluctant to follow orders that seemed designed to get them killed. Their morale was crumbling, their resolve wavering. But Broken Tooth was waking up. His head wound was bleeding, but his betrayal was still intact, a festering wound on his soul. He crawled toward a fallen soldier's rifle, his eyes fixed on Kalen, intent on shooting her while everyone was distracted by the battle. I saw the movement and swung my rifle around, but I was too far away. Broken Tooth's weapon was already rising toward the water trough where Chief Bearclaw's daughter lay hidden. That's when one of the Comanche warriors made a choice that shocked everyone. Instead of shooting at the cavalry, he put an arrow through Broken Tooth's chest, a swift, silent act that permanently ended the traitors' war. Chief Bearclaw looked at the warrior who'd killed his own band member and nodded grimly. Justice had been served in the middle of chaos, a brutal but necessary act. The battle was turning. The cavalry had lost 7 men to the Comanches too, and their ammunition was running low. But the Comanche were almost out of arrows, and several warriors were wounded badly enough that they could barely hold their weapons. I was down to my last box of cartridges when I heard something that changed everything. More horses, approaching from the east. At first I thought it was cavalry reinforcements, which would mean certain death for everyone defending the ranch. But these weren't soldiers. They were ranchers from the surrounding territory, drawn by the sound of sustained gunfire. Men who knew Jedediah Stone as an honest neighbor, a man who'd helped them through hard winters and shared water during droughts. Captain Sterling tried to wave them off, shouting that he was conducting a military operation against hostile Indians. But the ranchers had eyes. They could see me fighting alongside the Comanche. They could see the girl who was clearly wounded and being protected, rather than held captive. Old Silas Blackwood, who owned the spread 5 miles south, rode up to Captain Sterling, his own rifle, ready, his face grim. "What in hell are you doing, soldier boy, Silas?" bellowed his voice, carrying across the battlefield. "That's Jedediah Stone down there, and he's no Indian fighter unless someone gives him cause to be." Captain Sterling's authority was crumbling. His men were demoralized, his mission was exposed as something darker than a rescue. And now he had armed civilians questioning his orders. But wounded men with nothing to lose make dangerous enemies. The commander's hand moved to his sidearm, and I realized the officer was prepared to shoot his way out of this situation, rather than face a court-martial for attacking innocent ranchers. Chief Bearclaw saw it too, and our eyes met across the battlefield as we both understood what was about to happen. Captain Sterling drew his pistol on Silas Blackwood, a desperate final act of defiance. But Chief Bearclaw's tomahawk found his skull before the shot could fire a swift, brutal end to the conflict. The battle ended as suddenly as it had begun. The remaining soldiers, demoralized and leaderless, threw down their weapons when faced with 20 angry ranchers who'd known Jedediah Stone for years. These weren't career soldiers. They were farm boys and drifters who'd joined the army for steady pay, not to massacre civilians on a Texas ranch. Silas Blackwood dismounted and walked over to where I knelt beside the water trough, checking on Kalen's condition. The girl's fever had broken during the fighting, and her eyes were clearer now, though she was still weak from blood loss. Jed, Silas said quietly, his gaze sweeping over the carnage. "You want to tell me what this is all about?" So I told the story. Finding Kalen wounded, treating her injuries, the arrival of the war party, Broken Tooth's betrayal, and the army's attack on what should have been a peaceful resolution. The other ranchers listened in silence, their faces grim, understanding gradually that their neighbor had risked everything to save a life, to stand for something greater than himself. Chief Bearclaw approached slowly, his war paint streaked with sweat and gunpowder. He looked at the dead cavalry commander, then at the soldiers sitting in the dirt with their hands raised, then at the ranchers who'd intervened to stop a massacre. "This white man," the chief said, pointing at me, his voice resonating with a newfound respect, "has more honor than soldiers who wear blue coats." Silas nodded, his eyes meeting mine. "Jed's always been decent folk. If he says the girl needed help, then she needed help." But the situation was far from resolved. 23 soldiers were dead or wounded. A cavalry commander was scalped on my property, and a Comanche war party was standing in the middle of white ranchers' territory. This was the kind of incident that started wars between entire peoples, a spark that could ignite a powder keg. Chief Bearclaw seemed to understand this too. He spoke rapidly to his warriors, who began preparing to leave despite their own wounded. Better to retreat now than wait for more soldiers to arrive seeking vengeance. "Wait," I said, my voice cutting through the preparations. I looked at Kaylin, who was strong enough now to sit up on her own, her gaze steady. "She's not ready to travel. The wound could reopen." The chief's jaw tightened. Every minute they stayed increased the danger. But his daughter's life was worth more than tactical advantage. "We take that risk," he decided, his voice firm. But Kaylin had something to say about her own fate. She struggled to her feet, her small body trembling, but her resolve unwavering, and spoke in Comanche, her voice carrying the authority of a chief's daughter despite her youth. Whatever she said made her father's eyes widen with surprise. She was refusing to leave. She was claiming sanctuary at my ranch under Comanche law, putting herself under my protection until she was fully healed. Chief Bearclaw looked at me with an expression that mixed respect with deep concern. "She chooses to trust you with her life," he said, his gaze piercing. "If anything happens to her..." He didn't need to finish the threat, but he also handed me the medicine bag he'd offered earlier, sealing a bond that would change both our lives forever. That's when we heard the sound of more cavalry approaching from 3 different directions. The approaching cavalry turned out to be Colonel Vance from Fort Griffin, riding with 2 companies and a white flag. He'd come to negotiate, not to fight. Vance was old Army, a man who'd seen enough frontier violence to know the difference between justice and massacre. When he surveyed the scene at my ranch, the dead soldiers, the Comanche warriors and the ranchers standing together, he understood immediately that something had gone very wrong with his subordinate's mission. Commander Sterling was ordered to investigate reports of a kidnapping, Colonel Vance said carefully, his voice calm and measured. Not to engage in open warfare against civilians. Silas Blackwood spat tobacco juice in the dirt, his eyes narrowed. "Your boy Sterling was fixing to shoot me for asking questions. Colonel, if that chief hadn't put a tomahawk in his skull, we'd be burying white folks too." The colonel's experienced eyes took in the scene, Kaylin's medical bandages, the quality of treatment she'd received, the way the Comanche warriors were protecting rather than threatening her. This wasn't a kidnapping. It was a rescue that had turned into a political nightmare. But Vance had survived 30 years of frontier politics by finding solutions that satisfied everyone's honor without starting wars. He looked at Chief Bearclaw, then at me, then at the medicine bag hanging from my belt. "It appears there's been a misunderstanding," Colonel Vance said diplomatically, his voice smooth. "The Army received information that a white settler was holding a Comanche girl against her will. Clearly, that information was incorrect." Chief Bearclaw nodded slowly, his gaze steady. "White man saved my daughter's life. We came to honor this act, not to make war. And yet 23 soldiers are dead," Vance observed, his voice tinged with regret. "Because they attacked while we spoke of peace," the chief replied, his voice firm. "Your commander fired first." Vance could see the political calculation in the chief's words. Both sides needed a way to end this without losing face or starting a broader conflict. The truth was messy, but the solution could be simple. "I propose this," Vance said, his gaze sweeping over all of us. "The Army officially records that Commander Sterling exceeded his authority and attacked peaceful negotiations. The Comanche returned to their territory with our apologies for the misunderstanding. Mr. Stone continues his life as a respected member of this community. It was a face-saving lie that everyone could live with. The dead soldiers would be honored as victims of their commander's poor judgment, rather than heroes of a righteous cause." But Kaylin still refused to leave until her wound fully healed. For 2 weeks she stayed at my ranch under the protection of both Comanche law and Army guarantee. During that time, something unexpected happened. She began teaching me her language, the soft guttural sounds of her people, and I taught her to read English, the letters forming words that unlocked new worlds. We shared stories about our peoples, our losses, our hopes for a future where understanding might replace violence. We sat by the fire, the vast prairie stretching out under the endless stars, and talked, 2 souls from different worlds finding common ground in shared humanity. When she finally left riding strong and healthy back to her father's band, both of us had changed. The chief kept his word about protection for the rest of his life. No Comanche ever raided Jedediah Stone's land. More importantly, when other settlers in the territory faced raids or conflicts, they often came to me as a mediator, the white man who'd earned the Comanche chief's respect. Kaylin grew up to become a peace negotiator between her people and the encroaching settlements, using the reading skills I had taught her to understand treaties and legal documents that previous generations had signed without comprehension. She became a bridge just as I had between two worlds. And I never remarried, but I was never alone. My ranch became a neutral ground where Comanche and white settlers could meet safely to trade talk, and sometimes find solutions to conflicts that might otherwise have ended in bloodshed. The medicine bag Chief Bearclaw had given me still hung from my belt when I died peacefully 30 years later, surrounded by neighbors both white and Comanche, who mourned the passing of a man who'd proven that sometimes the right choice is the hardest one but ultimately the most rewarding. The story of Jedediah Stone and Kaylin carries profound lessons about compassion, forgiveness, and the courage to do what is right, even when it means standing against your own people. In a world where hatred and prejudice can easily spark war, Jed's decision to save a Comanche girl, the daughter of those who once destroyed his life, helped him reclaim the humanity he thought he had lost. He chose to honor the promise he made at his wife's grave to never let hatred consume what remained of his soul. The key message is this: compassion has the power to heal even the deepest wounds, not only for others but also for ourselves. Forgiveness is not weakness. It is the ultimate strength of the human spirit. For older audiences who have lived through loss, hardship, and injustice, this story serves as a reminder that we always have a choice to carry the heavy burden of anger or to lay it down and find peace. Sometimes a single act of kindness can become a lasting legacy, bridging divides, transforming communities, and leaving behind a mark that endures long after we are gone. Enjoying these epic Wild West stories? Hit subscribe for more gripping tales of bravery, conflict, and unexpected heroes. Now tap the video on screen to experience a story with a twist you'll never forget.